The students' morning chores. 20-year-old Johann Weber, known for his quiet dedication and strong work ethic, failed to show up for morning prayers. At first, his absence was dismissed as illness, but when his bed was found neatly made and his belongings untouched, concern began to spread among the students. The faculty offered a simple explanation. Johann had been called away suddenly to a remote mission in Iowa. A vague note was read aloud, supposedly written by Johann himself, expressing excitement for the opportunity. His family, however, never received direct communication from him again over the next 3 years. For more students vanished under nearly identical circumstances each time. The story was the same: a sudden call to serve a distant diocese, a quick departure with no goodbyes, and no further contact. When families wrote to the seminary or the diocese supposedly receiving the young men, they were either ignored or told that the students had arrived safely, but had since moved on. By 1852, rumors were quietly circulating among the remaining seminarians, whispers of nighttime arguments, muffled cries, and shadows moving in the hallways began to unsettle even the most devout students. Yet the strict environment and the priest's constant supervision made it nearly impossible to voice these concerns without fear of punishment. Then, in the spring of 1853, something shifted. Two seminarians, Thomas Morrison and Heinrich Müller, managed to escape one night under the cover of darkness. Their accounts, given later to a sympathetic priest in St. Louis, described a harrowing ordeal. According to them, Sacred Heart was not a place of holy training, but a front for human trafficking. They claimed that some students were sold into forced labor, while others, especially those with no known family ties, simply disappeared. Morrison recounted how students who resisted or asked too many questions were either drugged or beaten, then vanished overnight. Their story might have been dismissed if not for a fire that broke out at the seminary in late 1853. While the blaze was quickly contained, it revealed a hidden basement chamber beneath the chapel that few knew existed. Inside were shackles, ledgers, and documents written in both Latin and Irish Gaelic, many containing references to shipments, transfers, and remittances. Before local authorities could investigate further, the priests claimed that the room was used for storage by earlier builders and dismissed its contents as misunderstood. The diocese launched a quiet internal inquiry, led by Bishop Quarter himself, but the priests of Sacred Heart produced impressive documentation supporting their activities. They even presented letters of recommendation and copies of theological publications to prove their credentials. Ultimately, the investigation was closed, citing lack of evidence, and the matter was quietly buried. However, not long after, Rector Murphy and Dean O'Brien abruptly left the seminary, supposedly to take up new posts overseas. Father Walsh remained until 1862, when he vanished without notice. That same year, the seminary was officially closed. Citing declining enrollment and financial strain, the building was left to decay, eventually falling into disrepair, until it was partially demolished in the early 1900s. For decades, the story of Sacred Heart faded into local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among older clergy and dismissed as superstition. It wasn't until 2021, when a construction team working on a memorial project beneath the old chapel unearthed a sealed compartment, that the truth began to surface again. Inside, they found personal items belonging to the missing students, hidden letters from desperate families, and correspondences in Walsh's handwriting outlining payments and deliveries. These documents have since been authenticated and linked to bank transfers and shipping records from the 1850s, while the Vatican has declined to comment officially. Scholars who've reviewed the material say it paints a damning picture of systemic abuse, deception, and complicity at multiple levels of church authority. The story of Sacred Heart Seminary is not just about the loss of 17 young men. It's about how institutions can hide atrocities behind a facade of virtue and tradition, and how silence, obedience, and fear can allow that facade to stand for decades. It's a story that forces us to confront the darker chapters of history, even when they challenge the foundations of our beliefs. What are your thoughts on this disturbing case? Do you believe the church knew the truth all along? Could something like this have happened elsewhere? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more hidden histories and forgotten crimes, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching. One of the worst blizzards in Illinois history hit that week. Snow fell non-stop for 3 days, piling up until it reached the second-story windows of the seminary. Roads became completely impassable. It was exactly the kind of storm the imposter priests had been waiting for, a natural cover that would make any investigation nearly impossible for days. Michael Brennan, a 22-year-old from a well-off Irish family in Chicago, had shown strong promise in his theological studies. Father Walsh had recently chosen him to assist with special administrative work, giving him access to the seminary's financial records and correspondence. Michael's family, who ran 3 successful grocery stores serving Chicago's Irish community, had saved for more than 5 years to afford the steep $200 yearly tuition and investment they believed would secure their son's future in the priesthood and elevate their own standing in the Catholic community. Just days before he disappeared, Michael had written to his parents. His letter, later recovered from Walsh's personal files, was full of gratitude. He was honored to be trusted with new responsibilities and thrilled to be starting advanced coursework in moral theology. There was no sign of doubt, worry, or any desire to leave. On the night of February 13, 1848, Michael was called to Father Walsh's private office after dinner. Several students remembered seeing him heading down the hallway around 8:30 p.m., carrying a leather folder with his notes and assignments. The office was located in a far wing of the building, separated from the dormitories by thick stone walls that muffled sound. Around 9 p.m., some students later recalled hearing raised voices coming from that direction. Though the words were unclear, it was clearly an argument, and it lasted nearly an hour, punctuated by tense silences and bursts of shouting. By 10:15, the noise stopped completely and silence returned. Joseph Kennedy, Michael's roommate and closest friend, stayed awake until nearly midnight waiting for him to return. When Michael still hadn't come back by the early morning prayers at 4:30 a.m., Joseph assumed he'd been allowed to sleep in due to his new responsibilities. It wasn't until after morning mass that Walsh addressed Michael's absence. Standing at the chapel's pulpit, he told the students that Michael had been called away urgently during the night to minister to victims of a cholera outbreak in a remote Iowa settlement. Their priest had died suddenly, and the community was left without spiritual guidance. According to Walsh, Michael had volunteered for the dangerous task, showing the kind of selfless devotion expected of those truly called to serve. At first, the story made sense. Cholera was known to devastate frontier communities, and it was true that priests often died while caring for the sick. Michael's sudden departure was seen as an act of bravery, one that reinforced the students' own sense of purpose. But Joseph couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Michael's heavy coat, boots, and gloves were still hanging in their room, items that would have been absolutely necessary for a trip through sub-zero temperatures in February. The night of his supposed departure, the thermometer had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Traveling without winter gear would have been nearly impossible. Even stranger, Michael had said nothing the night before about any kind of emergency mission. He and Joseph had spent the evening talking, as they always did, about their studies and hopes for the future. Michael had been enthusiastic about his academic work and seemed genuinely excited to continue. What troubled Joseph most was seeing Michael's silver rosary still lying on the bedside table. It had belonged to his grandmother, who had died during the Irish famine. Michael had worn it every day since arriving. There was no way he would have left it behind. When Joseph quietly raised these concerns with Father Walsh, he was met with an unexpectedly harsh response. Walsh accused him of being prideful and distrustful, qualities he said were dangerous to both spiritual growth and religious obedience. He warned that such attitudes could lead to spiritual ruin. If not corrected. As punishment, Joseph was ordered to spend a week in solitary prayer and fasting in the seminary's basement chapel, a cold, damp room carved into the hillside beneath the building. Students were sent there to reflect on their sins in isolation, and it was deliberately harsh. Moisture constantly seeped from the stone walls. The only light came from candles, and a single small brazier provided little warmth. During his confinement, Joseph began hearing things late at night, usually around 2 a.m. When the seminary was supposed to be silent, he'd hear the clatter of hooves and the creaking of wagon wheels just above the chapel. The sounds were unmistakable, and they came from the direction of the main road, as if someone was arriving quietly. Then he'd hear voices, 3 of them, always the same: Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien. He couldn't make out their words, but the tone was low and urgent. Next came dragging noises, grunts of effort, and the groaning of wagon springs. Flickering lantern light filtered through the chapel's one small, dirt-covered window, casting shifting shadows on the stone walls. The whole process took about an hour. Then the wagon would leave, heading away from the main road towards Springfield, not Chicago. The next morning, everything appeared normal. On the third night, Joseph moved closer to the window and saw them more clearly through the grimy glass. He could just make out 3 men loading something into the back of a covered wagon. Whatever it was large and heavy, wrapped tightly in dark cloth. It took all 3 to lift it, and they handled it not like a bundle of supplies, but like something fragile. 6 weeks later, another student disappeared. Thomas Gallagher, 20, was widely known as the kindest and most devout among the group. He prayed often, helped classmates with Latin, and never lost his temper. His father, Klaus Gallagher, once Klaus Muller, had worked his way up from a brewery laborer to foreman. His mother, Anna, took in sewing to help pay for Thomas's education. The family had sold their small farm and moved into a city apartment, just to send him to Sacred Heart. On the evening of March 30th, 1848, Thomas was approached by Dean O'Brien during evening prayers. O'Brien whispered that Father Walsh needed to speak with him immediately about a matter concerning his academic performance. Thomas looked confused but obeyed. He told his close friend, Hinrich Weber, that he didn't know of any issues with his studies and had no idea why he'd been summoned. Later that night, students in rooms near the office reported hearing raised voices. At least 3 people involved. The argument came and went in waves, lasting until around 11 p.m. Some students said they recognized Thomas's voice growing more upset as time went on. At around 10:30, sounds of heavy furniture being moved could be heard, followed by total silence. Then, just after 11, students again heard the muffled clatter of a wagon moving away slowly into the night. The next morning, Walsh announced that Thomas had left the seminary. He said Thomas had experienced a deep spiritual crisis and confessed 2 unclean thoughts incompatible with priesthood. Rather than face failure, he'd chosen to retreat to a contemplative monastery in the Wisconsin wilderness, where years of silence and prayer might lead to a different kind of spiritual life. It was a carefully crafted explanation, one that mirrored real struggles many students faced. Celibacy was difficult, and the shame tied to such temptations often drove students into isolation or withdrawal. Walsh's story felt plausible, but again, the details didn't match. Thomas's cherished rosary, carved by his dying mother, was still in his room. It had never left his side. It lay neatly on his desk. So did $50 in personal funds from his family, money no one from a modest background would leave behind without good reason. Worst of all, an unfinished letter to his younger sister Maria was also on the desk. In it, Thomas described how grateful he was to be at the seminary, how each day brought him closer to God. The letter ended mid-sentence, right as he was expressing how blessed he felt in his calling. Hinrich, who had discussed the letter with Thomas the night before, knew his friend had been excited, not distressed. He had plans for advanced study and spoke of his future as a priest. With hope and pride, these disappearances, only 6 weeks apart, were no longer isolated events. For those paying attention, the pattern had become too clear to ignore. He had planned to finish the letter the next day. In fact, he'd even told Maria he wanted to include a reflection on an inspiring lecture Father Walsh had recently given on moral theology. As whispers about the disappearances quietly spread through the seminary, students grew increasingly uneasy, but no one ever discussed it openly. When the 3 priests were around, out of the original 12 students, had now vanished in just 6 weeks. While each explanation, taken on its own, seemed believable, the pattern was harder to ignore. Some students still defended the priest's accounts. They argued that God's call could come without warning, and that true devotion sometimes meant walking away from family and possessions. But others began to see details that didn't sit right. Both Michael and Thomas came from families that had sacrificed a great deal to send them to the seminary. Both were excellent students with bright futures in the church, and both had been called to private meetings with Father Walsh shortly before they disappeared. They had also left behind deeply personal belongings, things that no one would voluntarily abandon. There had been no signs they were planning to leave. The atmosphere at Sacred Heart slowly began to shift. Students grew quieter, more guarded. In their conversations, they avoided asking questions that might seem like they were doubting the priests. The sense of community that had once brought the group together was replaced by a growing sense of fear. As spring approached, the disappearances continued. By Christmas of 1848, 5 more students were gone, and the explanations offered by the priests became more elaborate and confident, suggesting they no longer feared being questioned. The third to disappear was Antoine Dubois, a French student from Detroit whose family had grown wealthy in the fur trade. Antoine was known for his wilderness skills and fluency in Native American languages, which would have made him useful to anyone seeking labor for frontier work. The official story was that he had left to help a remote French settlement under threat from local tribes. Next was Henrik Weber, Thomas Gallagher's closest friend. He had started asking too many questions. The priests claimed he had been transferred to a specialized seminary in Baltimore to serve German-speaking communities. The transfer, they said, was so urgent and confidential that he couldn't say goodbye or even write to his family until he had settled in. By the end of that year, only 7 students remained. They lived under a constant cloud of anxiety. Each one feared being summoned to Father Walsh's office next. The remaining students developed quiet ways to look out for each other. They took note of who was being called for private meetings and kept mental records of which belongings were left behind. Trying to spot signs of a coming disappearance, Joseph Kennedy, still haunted by the memory of Michael's sudden vanishing and his time in the basement chapel, could no longer focus on his studies. He began noticing patterns he had once overlooked. The disappearances always happened on cold, overcast nights, difficult weather for travel, but ideal for avoiding detection. They never occurred on weekends when outsiders might visit, and they always followed lengthy, private meetings with Father Walsh. Joseph also began to notice changes in the 3 priests that didn't align with their roles or humble beginnings. Father Walsh, who had arrived with plain clothes and few belongings, now wore ornate silk vestments during Mass. He had an expensive Swiss gold pocket watch and had furnished his office with a polished mahogany desk imported from Ireland. Rector Murphy had somehow acquired an impressive collection of leather-bound theological books, editions more common in elite European universities than in small-town seminaries. He now wore gold-rimmed spectacles and a seal ring he claimed was his family crest. Though none of the Irish students recognized it, Dean O'Brien underwent the most visible transformation. He now rode a striking black stallion, which he said had been a gift from parishioners in Ireland. The horse was clearly a thoroughbred and worth hundreds. O'Brien rode with the ease of a wealthy gentleman, not a parish priest. He also began making frequent trips to Chicago, always returning with new items and an air of satisfaction that didn't match the humble mission of a seminary leader. Their trips grew longer and more frequent. They claimed to be meeting with church officials in Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis in their absence. An elderly lay brother named Francis McManus oversaw the students. McManus had arrived with the priests and acted as their assistant, but he quickly became a source of discomfort. Among the students, he spoke little, moved nervously, and often seemed on edge, though he never said why. Any attempt to ask him about his background or his duties was met with evasiveness or visible distress. When students brought up the missing classmates, McManus would abruptly change the subject or excuse himself. Some students noticed he knew the grounds far too well down to the locations of storage rooms and root cellars that were never shown during tours. He also knew paths through the surrounding woods that didn't match his supposed role as someone who rarely left the seminary. More troubling still was the level of control the priests had over all communication. Letters from families were answered, but always in Father Walsh's handwriting, never the students'. These replies followed a careful script. Families were told that spiritual development required extended silence, and that students were not permitted to write home until they'd reached certain milestones. If parents pressed for updates, they were told their sons were progressing, but needed to focus completely on God. Any concerns were gently deflected with religious language and vague reassurances. Outside the seminary, the nearby town of Millfield, home to just a few hundred residents, also began to notice strange activity. Farmers spotted covered wagons moving at night along the old road between Sacred Heart and a highway to Chicago. The wagons moved slowly and quietly, always at odd hours. Samuel Morrison, who owned the farm closest to the seminary, reported finding personal items along the fence line between his land and church property. Among them were a prayer book labeled with Michael Brennan's name, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that had belonged to Heinrich Weber, and a silver crucifix known to have been worn by Thomas Gallagher. When Morrison tried to return the items, Father Walsh told him the students had discarded them willingly as part of their spiritual discipline to give up earthly attachments. But by the winter of 1849 to 1850, everything changed. Church authorities from multiple dioceses joined forces with federal marshals and carefully selected local law enforcement. Their goal: to shut down the operation and secure enough evidence to bring the perpetrators to justice. Every move was planned with care to prevent escape or destruction of critical records. At dawn on March 20, 1850, a dozen armed men surrounded the seminary, blocking every possible route out. The arrests were quick and intense. Walsh tried to maintain his priestly persona, accusing the authorities of anti-Catholic bias and insisting the matter be handled within church channels. But when Montini presented proof of his true identity, the performance collapsed. The man known as Father Edmund Walsh was actually Seamus McKenna, a known criminal from Dublin with a long record of violence, theft, and trafficking. Investigators learned that he'd once belonged to a gang targeting Irish families fleeing famine. The group gained victims' trust through false religious connections before robbing or abducting them. The attack on Bridge Hope had been no accident. McKenna's crew knew the priest's travel plans and had intercepted the ship using a disguised vessel. After torturing and killing the clergy, they assumed their identities to infiltrate the American church. Murphy was actually Liam Doherty, McKenna's second-in-command and an expert in forgery and financial fraud. He'd studied enough theology to pass as a priest while setting up systems to launder money from their trafficking ring. O'Brien turned out to be Fergus Lynch, the most violent of the group, responsible for transporting victims and personally murdering those who threatened to expose the operation. What investigators found at Sacred Heart shocked even the most seasoned officials. Search teams scoured the 400-acre property and uncovered 7 graves. The victims had been buried with care, often in remote corners of the grounds. Autopsies showed that all were killed by blunt force trauma to the head, likely to prevent them from speaking out. The burial techniques showed a disturbing level of planning and experience. But Sacred Heart was only one part of a much wider operation. Documents recovered from hidden areas linked the seminary to other institutions across Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. Federal agents and church officials traced buyers in all 5 states, business owners who had purchased trafficked victims for hard labor in coal mines, lumber camps, farms, and factories. In total, the network had earned over $100,000, a staggering amount in the 1850s. The profits rivaled those of entire towns. The 3 men were transported to Springfield, Illinois, to stand trial for murder, kidnapping, trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. The case drew national attention as one of the first major legal efforts to dismantle a human trafficking ring in the U.S. Newspapers published every detail. The idea that a religious institution had been used as a front for organized crime shocked the public. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence detailed transaction records, letters from buyers, falsified ledgers, and first-hand accounts from James and other witnesses. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from Samuel Morrison, the farmer who lived next to the seminary. He had seen strange wagons at night, discovered scattered belongings near his fence, and noticed disturbed soil where bodies were later found. The jury found all three men guilty. They were sentenced to death and hanged on August 15, 1851. Over 5,000 people gathered to witness the execution, including victims' families, Catholic officials, and anti-Catholic activists who used the case to fuel long-standing prejudice. Of the 10 trafficked students who were not murdered, 6 were eventually found and freed. They bore both visible and invisible scars, injuries from brutal labor, and deep psychological trauma from their captivity. Some healed with time, others never fully recovered. The remaining 4, Heinrich Weber from Milwaukee, Antoine Du Bois from Detroit, Patrick Kelly from Chicago, and Sean O'Malley from Boston, were never found. Their families continued to hope, but their fates remain unknown. James Ollie, whose determination had exposed the entire operation, was offered the chance to complete his seminary training at any Catholic institution in America or Europe. The Church promised fast-track advancement in recognition of his bravery, but James declined. Instead, he joined federal law enforcement, drawing from his experiences at Sacred Heart. He dedicated his life to fighting trafficking and protecting vulnerable communities. Over his 30-year career, James helped rescue more than 300 victims and put over 100 traffickers behind bars. His work laid the groundwork for modern investigative techniques used in anti-trafficking efforts. To this day, the Catholic Church, meanwhile, faced a long road to recovery. The scandal had damaged its credibility across the Midwest. Church leaders responded by overhauling how clergy were vetted and assigned. Multiple layers of documentation were now required. For any priest coming to America, encrypted telegraph systems were developed for quick cross-continental verification. Independent inspections became routine, especially in remote institutions. Sacred Heart Seminary itself was shut down within weeks of the arrests. The building, a grand Gothic revival structure, once meant to symbolize faith and education, was eventually demolished. The land was sold to local farmers who wanted nothing to do with it. For years afterward, people in the area reported strange sounds, unexplained voices, phantom wagon wheels, even bells ringing from a church that no longer stood. Whether these were supernatural events or echoes of a community's trauma, no one knows. But the site remains shunned, marked by a history too heavy to ignore. This case reveals how easily trust can be exploited, especially during times of upheaval. In the 1840s, immigrant communities were especially vulnerable, and religious institutions meant to offer protection could be turned into tools for abuse. The Sacred Heart case serves as a powerful reminder: when institutions operate in isolation, without oversight, the risk of exploitation grows. But it's also a story of how accountability can prevail. Once Bishop Montini applied proper investigative tools, the truth unraveled quickly. And when individuals like James choose courage over silence, even the darkest conspiracies can be exposed. The techniques used by the criminals posing as trusted leaders, isolating their victims, offering false explanations, and silencing dissent are not confined to the past. They are still used by traffickers today. This story is a warning, not just about what happened, but what can happen again. What do you think of this chilling story? Does it make you question the stories we're told by powerful institutions? Do you believe oversight can prevent similar tragedies? Or is human nature always vulnerable to corruption when power goes unchecked? Let us know in the comments. And if this investigation left you thinking, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our deep dives into the untold parts of American history. Share this video with anyone who values real stories and real courage. And remember, asking hard questions is often the first step toward justice.